Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most studied human beings who ever lived. Thousands of books, hundreds of biographies, decades of scholarship. And yet, deep inside his DNA, something was hiding that none of it predicted. Genetic analysis of authenticated Napoleon hair samples uncovered a Y-chromosome haplogroup that does not belong to Western Europe at all. It points east, far east of France. And if you carry Mediterranean, North African, or Levantine ancestry, this is your story too. Let's start with what everyone believed. Napoleon was born in 1769 in Ajaccio, Corsica, an island that had just been transferred from Genoa to France. His family, the Bonapartes, claimed Italian noble descent. His father Carlo was a minor lawyer and local aristocrat. His mother Letizia, a Ramolino by birth. Both families local Corsican nobility, Italian in name and culture. French, Italian, Catholic, European. That was the official story, the one Napoleon himself promoted, the one the history books accepted. But Corsica's history is not that simple, and neither is his genome. Now let's talk about the evidence. Because the DNA work on Napoleon is genuinely remarkable, and it has been cross-checked against multiple authenticated samples. Hair samples from Napoleon have been preserved in collections across Europe and the United States. Locks cut at his death on St. Helena in 1821, and others taken during his life. Scientists have tested several of these samples independently. The results keep pointing in the same direction. Napoleon's paternal Y-chromosome haplogroup, the genetic signature passed directly from father to son, unchanged through generations, is E1B1B1C1. That haplogroup is rare in France. It is rare across most of Western Europe, but it is concentrated, strongly, in populations from the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and parts of North Africa. Specifically, researchers found this haplogroup concentrated among Levantine Arabic populations and certain North African Berber communities. This is not a trace. This is Napoleon's direct paternal line, his father's father's father, going back as far as the Y chromosome can carry you. So the question becomes, how did a Levantine or North African paternal lineage end up in a Corsican family claiming Italian noble ancestry? The answer takes us back a very long way, and it runs straight through the island beneath his feet. Corsica is one of the most genetically complex places in the Western Mediterranean, and most people have no idea. The island has been settled, invaded, and traded through by Phoenicians, Greeks, Etruscans, Romans, Vandals, Byzantines, Arabs, Genoese, and Aragonese. Over 3,000 years of layered occupation. Every one of those waves left genetic traces in the population. Corsicans are not simply Italian, they never were. Research from the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique has shown that Corsican genetic clusters are distinct from mainland Italian populations, with measurable North African and Near Eastern components. So Napoleon's unexpected haplogroup is not an anomaly. It is the island's deep history written into one family's line. But let's trace the specific migration that brought that eastern lineage to the island, because the story has a name, a route, and a precise historical window. The strongest candidate is the Arab-Berber presence in the Western Mediterranean between the 8th and 11th centuries. Between 825 and the mid-11th century, Arab forces controlled significant parts of the central Mediterranean, including Sardinia, Sicily, and regular maritime activity around Corsica. This was not a brief raid. This was multi-generational habitation, intermarriage, and settlement, lasting long enough to leave a permanent genetic mark. Children were born. Lines of descent were established. And those Y chromosomes did not disappear when the political situation changed. They stayed. They stayed through the Genoese period, through the centuries of Italian influence, through the family's Catholic baptisms and noble titles. They stayed until they reached one particular child, born in 1769, who would one day crown himself Emperor of the French. There is a second dimension to this finding. Because the E1B1B haplogroup family, the broader group Napoleon's specific variant belongs to, has an ancient story far older than the medieval period. Geneticists at the National Geographic Genographic Project traced E1B1B to an origin in Northeast Africa or the Levant between 22,000 and 26,000 years ago. 25,000 years ago, the last ice age. These were the people moving through the Levantine corridor as glaciers locked most of the northern world. Over millennia, their descendants spread north and west, into the Maghreb, up through the Nile Valley, across into Anatolia, and eventually into southern Europe. Today, E1B1B is found at significant frequency in Ethiopia, Somalia, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, the Levant, and in scattered pockets across southern Europe, including Sicily and Sardinia, and Corsica, where one branch of that ancient line quietly persisted, in olive groves, fishing villages, local families who didn't know they were carrying a 25,000-year-old piece of human migration history. Now here is the part that historians initially found uncomfortable. Napoleon built one of the most powerful European empires in history. His identity, French, European, Enlightenment-era rational man, was central to his entire political project. Yet his DNA was telling a different story, one that rooted him not in the chateau of France, but in the ancient migration corridors of the Near East and North Africa. His enemies knew it. English caricaturists mocked him as swarthy, southern, oriental, not truly European. They were being cruel. But the genetic data suggests they were, in one specific sense, not entirely wrong. The irony is profound. The man who invaded Egypt, who stood before the pyramids and told his troops that 40 centuries looked down upon them, carried genes that connected him to those very lands. He was not just a conqueror looking at an alien civilization. He was, in the deepest biological sense, partly coming home. Now let's be precise about what the science does and does not say, because this matters. The Y-chromosome haplogroup is one line of descent, the paternal line only. It tells you about Napoleon's father's father's father going back in time. It says nothing about his mother's line or any of his other ancestral threads. His mother Letizia was a Ramolino, also Corsican, also carrying the island's deep genetic mixture, but her line is a different story, carried in different chromosomes. What the full genome analysis, the autosomal work, shows is that Napoleon was broadly South European, consistent with Corsican ancestry. The Near Eastern signal is present, but not dominant in his overall profile. But the paternal haplogroup, the one thing that persists unchanged down the male line, is unambiguous, and it is Eastern, and it is ancient. The research team that established this was led by Gerard Lucotte of the Université Paris 7th, working from authenticated hair samples with documented provenance chains going back to St. Helena. Lucotte's team also analysed samples from Napoleon's son, the King of Rome, and found the same haplogroup confirmed in the paternal line. The finding was consistent and reproducible. This is not a single reading, not one contested sample, multiple specimens, independent analysis, consistent results. Now let's zoom out. Because Napoleon is not the only European ruler whose DNA has surprised researchers, he is part of a wider pattern. The Mediterranean, for thousands of years, was not a barrier. It was a highway. People moved back and forth across it constantly. Merchants, soldiers, refugees, conquerors, slaves, pilgrims. Every crossing left a genetic trace. Every settlement, every marriage across cultural lines, every enslaved person who survived and had children, all of it is written in the genomes of people living today. Napoleon's genome is a single data point in that vast record, a famous one, but not an exceptional one. Now let's get to what this means for Napoleon himself. The man, the mind, the body that historians have argued about for 200 years. He was famously short, or so the legend goes. In reality, at 5'6" in French units, he was average height for a Frenchman of his era. The short Napoleon was English propaganda, amplified by incompatible measurement systems. He had olive skin, dark hair, dark eyes. Those features, which made him look distinctly non-French to Northern European eyes, are now legible in a new light. They were Corsican features. And Corsican features are the physical record of the same migrations his Y-chromosome is tracing. There is also the question of his health. Napoleon suffered from a range of conditions, skin irritation, gastric ulcers, possibly hepatic problems, that have generated decades of medical speculation. Some researchers have proposed arsenic poisoning as a factor in his death. Others point to stomach cancer. The DNA does not resolve this, but it does rule out several genetic disease hypotheses that assumed a purely Northern European ancestry. What did survive, unmistakably, was his intelligence, his physical resilience, his extraordinary capacity for work. Whatever the genome's origin, it produced one of the most formidable minds in recorded history. Now let's talk about the Bonaparte line more broadly, because Napoleon was not the last of it. Napoleon had brothers, Joseph, Lucien, Louis, Jerome, who all produced male lines. Some of those lines survive to the present day. Living Bonaparte male line descendants, confirmed by Lucotte's research, carry the same E1b1b1c1 haplogroup. The ancient Eastern lineage persists in the 21st century. Somewhere in the world right now, there are men who share Napoleon's paternal haplogroup. Men who have no idea that their Y chromosome is genetically identical to his. The personal pivot here is significant. If your ancestry is Corsican, Sicilian, Sardinian, North African, Levantine, or broadly southern Mediterranean, you are swimming in the same genetic waters. The haplogroup E1b1b family is not rare in these populations. It sits in them at frequencies ranging from 8% in some southern Italian communities to over 70% in parts of the Horn of Africa. If you have taken a DNA ancestry test and found a Southern European or North African component, particularly in your paternal line, there is a real possibility you carry something closely related to what Napoleon carried. Not his genome, yours. Built from the same ancient migrations, the same crossings, the same Mediterranean centuries of mixture. Let's go back to the island, because Corsica itself deserves more attention than it usually gets in these conversations. Corsica's genetic isolation, it is an island, and islands preserve ancient lineages, means it functions as a kind of genetic museum. Lineages that were diluted or disappeared on the mainland, overwhelmed by later migrations, survived in Corsica simply because the island's population was smaller and more isolated. Research by Stefania Sarno and colleagues at the University of Bologna has confirmed that Corsican populations carry a significantly higher proportion of ancient Mediterranean ancestry than mainland European populations nearby. Napoleon was not simply a Frenchman, he was a Corsican, and being Corsican means carrying the Mediterranean world's full genetic depth. Here is the turning point. The moment the official story and the genetic story finally collide. Napoleon's entire imperial identity was built on a fiction of European legitimacy. He redesigned the European map. He claimed the lineage of Charlemagne. He had himself depicted as a Roman emperor. He built an entirely European mythological identity. And his Y-chromosome was saying, North Africa, the Levant, the ancient Near East. 25,000 years before Europe was even a concept. This is not a scandal. This is not a diminishment. If anything, it is richer. A man carrying 25,000 years of movement across the ancient world, who rose to reshape the modern one. The empire fell. Napoleon died alone on St. Helena in 1821, aged 51, 3,000 miles from Corsica. But the lineage continued. His brother's lines survived. And beyond the Bonaparte family, the ancient haplogroup he carried kept spreading through the descendants of every Corsican, Sicilian, and North African family that had carried it for centuries. Many of those families ended up in the Americas. Louisiana, New Orleans, Argentina, the Caribbean, places that received waves of southern Mediterranean immigration in the 19th and 20th centuries. If your family came from southern Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, North Africa, or the Levant, and settled in America, you may be carrying a genetic signature that goes back to the same ancient world Napoleon's DNA is pointing at. Not Napoleon's empire, his ancestry, the 25,000-year-old trail that he happened to be one link in. Let's talk about what else the Bonaparte DNA work revealed, because there were other findings beyond the haplogroup. The autosomal DNA, the genome-wide data, confirmed that Napoleon had significant Neolithic Anatolian farmer ancestry, consistent with southern European populations. These were the farming populations that spread from Anatolia across Europe beginning around 8,000 years ago, replacing much of the indigenous hunter-gatherer population as they went. In southern Europe and the Mediterranean islands, that Anatolian farmer ancestry is preserved at higher levels than in northern Europe, where later Bronze Age steppe migrations diluted it substantially. Napoleon was, genetically, a Mediterranean man of Neolithic farmer descent with an ancient Eastern paternal line. Nothing about that is simple. There is one more layer to this. Napoleon himself, whether consciously or not, seemed to identify with exactly the Eastern world his DNA connects him to. He expressed admiration for Islam. He reportedly told the Egyptian ulama that he considered himself a Muslim in spirit. He commissioned the Institut d'Egypte and produced the first systematic study of ancient Egyptian civilization. Historians have debated whether this was pure political calculation or something deeper. The DNA does not answer that question, but it does make it a more interesting one. What we can say with confidence, the man was more complex, more layered, and more deeply rooted in the ancient world than the European emperor mythology ever allowed. And that complexity is not a contradiction. It is the human condition. We are all of us carrying migrations we never knew about, lineages that crossed deserts, seas, and centuries before they reached us. Napoleon just happened to be famous enough that we could check. So what survives? What is Napoleon's genetic legacy in the world today, beyond the few Bonaparte male line descendants who carry his exact haplogroup? The haplogroup E1b1b is alive and thriving across North Africa, the Horn of Africa, the Levant, and in pockets across southern Europe. It is not rare. It is not dying. It is one of the most successful ancient human lineages on Earth. And culturally, Napoleon's legacy reshaped the legal systems of 22 countries. The Napoleonic Code is still the foundation of law in France, Quebec, Louisiana, Spain, Italy, and across Latin America. A man whose Y-chromosome traced back to the ancient Near East built the legal framework that governs the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people. That is what the genome reveals. Not just where Napoleon's ancestors came from, but how far a single human lineage, ancient, layered, and improbably placed, can reach. If your ancestry touches the Mediterranean, any of it, you are part of this story. Not metaphorically, biologically. The same ancient migrations that carried Napoleon's paternal line from the Near East to Corsica carried countless other lines to countless other families, to yours. The Emperor of the French was, in his genome, a child of the ancient world. And so, in ways your DNA test is only beginning to reveal, are you? If this changed how you see your own ancestry, share it with someone who carries the same roots,